when I think about food security, which is my objective really in my research, is improving food security, is how does this industry look and how sustainable is it and who's winning and who's losing in the process. So there's so many questions to ask.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast. I'm your host, Andre Marder. It's widely agreed that one of our greatest global environmental challenges is the impact of fisheries on the oceans. Aquaculture, practiced at a small scale around the world, especially in Asia, for centuries, emerged decades ago as a potential solution. But it soon became clear that aquaculture was using more wild-caught fish as feed, as an input into the system, than it was actually generating as product. In other words, it was making the situation even worse. But things have changed in the way that we manage this final frontier of agricultural intensification. And this story is not all about the ocean. Although mariculture, marine aquaculture, already supplies more than 50% of the world's seafood, freshwater aquaculture is far larger still. So aquaculture as a whole is a pretty big deal. Economist Roz Naylor is a professor of Earth System Science at Stanford University's Center for Food Security and the Environment. She led a seminal review to examine the effect of aquaculture on world fish supplies, which was published in the journal Nature in 2000. 20 years later, she led the publication of a 20-year retrospective review of global aquaculture, again in Nature. Both papers took an exhaustive look at all the literature available at the time to piece together comprehensive narratives that outlined the pros and the cons, the advances and the obstacles of one of humankind's most important and promising food systems and its impact on the environment. Roz was kind enough to share some of her knowledge with me, and I began by asking her what aquaculture is and what it includes.
So aquaculture is the cultivation of plants, animals, and algae in both freshwater and marine ecosystems. In my definition, it includes, and in the definition of the Food and Agricultural Organization, it includes those that actually go to full production. So not just the release of fish into the wild, but actually the cultivation fully to the product.
Okay, and then as far as where aquaculture happens, I understand that the vast majority of it is in Asia. And I was also, as I mentioned just before we started recording, I was also amazed to hear that the majority is freshwater.
That's right. Over 90%, I think 92% by the latest statistics was in Asian countries. And the majority of that is in freshwater systems. It came as a surprise to actually even the author team, because when I assembled the author team, I really wanted to have people on the freshwater side as well as the marine. And as we say in the paper, the vast majority of papers that are written, particularly about the sustainability of aquaculture, deal with mariculture.
Right.
Hardly even touch freshwater at all. And yet by far the biggest growth and the biggest opportunities actually for meeting food supplies is going to be from these freshwater systems. And so, and they're, in my view, understudied in terms of their environmental impact and more studied for their livelihood impact, which is important. In places like Bangladesh, they've doubled the production of fish in the past decade. I think that the mariculture has been much more controversial. And so a lot of the papers are either defending or trying to dig into the sustainability issues related to the topics from our first paper, actually, which dealt with the use of wild fish in the feed. And a lot of these marine species, if they're not filter feeders, like shellfish or seaweeds or whatever, they're going to be relying on feeds. And so, the question immediately comes to your mind, well, are we getting more fish out, or are we actually out of the new system, or are we taking more fish from the oceans? So that is a big issue that has engaged a lot. But there's other, I think it's because of the public nature of the resources too. And, almost like the tragedy of the commons, that you're going to be in these waters where you can't actually protect very well against escapes and diseases and other things, and it's also true in inland water systems. But I think it's more so in these systems that are just wide open. And so it's just been the big debate. It's much more polarized in the mariculture space than it is in the inland water space.
And then as far as you sort of briefly mentioned what it encompasses, but I understand there's now, if I remember correctly from the paper, something like in the 400 range of numbers of species of different plants and algae and fish and all the rest of it. Is that about right? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, there is, by recent statistics, about 425 different species. And then there are a number of species groups that are unidentified. Sometimes these are just not elsewhere indicated in the data, so it's hard to say what species those actually are. So I would say there are between 450 to 500 species overall that are probably cultivated.
Okay, and what are the major groups, without going into too much detail, what are the ones that are mostly cultivated?
So a lot of times this is based on live weight measurements. This is the weight of the product at harvest. And so the big ones are actually the filter feeders, the shellfish and the seaweeds. Seaweeds is mostly water, and shellfish is mostly shell. So they just weigh more. So if you look at the main categories, the big ones would be Japanese kelp, different Euchaena seaweeds, and different carps, the grass carps, silver carps, and cupped oysters is another one, a big category. Okay. Shrimp would be the one that is most common to the Western diet, and white leg shrimp is about 4%. And then Nile tilapia, which is another one that's eaten globally, is about 4%. But otherwise, you see these species of macroalgae or shellfish or carps that are mainly consumed in an Asian context.
And I guess it was, you mentioned the live weight. So the live weight is the one way of measuring, and then the other, the product, is that the correct terminology?
Yeah, we would otherwise measure it when we're thinking about what it's contributing to people's diets. We think about edible weight. So once you take the live weight and you shrink it down to what gets put on the plate, finfish, which includes carp or tilapia, about 89% of the live weight actually goes into edible weight. So most of those fish are eaten. But when you think about seaweeds or you think about cupped oysters, it's below 10% of the live weight is actually edible.
Right. So in the case of seaweed, that's mostly water. In the case of shellfish, it's mostly shell. And then I guess there's a difference that maybe I'm getting into a bit of detail here, but I guess there's a bit of a difference there because for seaweed, the water evaporates, but for shellfish, the shells are actually used for other things, right?
Yeah, they're used in all sorts of industrial products. Really, what I love about the aquaculture sector is, like any food system, almost everything is used. If you think about a finfish, and most finfish are still consumed in Asia as well, and the diet there is to eat the heads and eat the bone. So you actually eat most of that fish as well, whereas in the United States, and maybe is the case in Japan, you have more fillets and you're taking away 15% of the live weight.
Right.
Seeds are mostly made into industrial products. So there is some percentage that's very hard to actually get the actual number because the statistics aren't very reliable. But between 20 and 30%, maybe at the upper bound of the harvested seaweed, is going into food. But most of it is actually going into products that are used either in the food system or in the biofuel system. For example, as a product that would prevent crystallization in chickens when it's frozen, products that are just used in food processing and in other processing, not in direct food consumption.
I see. Okay.
So Japan is very interesting because you're eating seaweed a lot directly. Japan and Korea really do eat most of their seaweed directly, but you see these huge seaweed systems in macroalgae systems in China and Indonesia, and most of that's going into industrial products.
So just a bit of a tack change, but we'd be interested to ask and to find out. I know that you're an economist, and I was just curious to know. I mean, there are obvious economic angles to this discussion, but what was it about aquaculture that got you interested in the topic and involved in the topic? Because I understand this is quite a big part of your work.
Yes, it is. And I actually work in all elements of the food system, so in crop, livestock, and fisheries aquaculture. And so my research has really focused on the intensification of these systems, which enables the yield to go up and have more product to feed a growing population. But also, intensification typically brings the price down and enables people of all incomes to be able to afford food. And so what was interesting to me in taking aquaculture on was it was the last intensification of a food system. You know, if you think about going out and capturing fish in the wild, that's the last hunter-gatherer activity that we really have at a commercial scale.
Mm.
And this aquaculture is allowing the intensification, which can make it much more widely available at an affordable price for everybody. You know, so to me, when I think about food security, which is my objective really in my research, is improving food security, is how does this industry look and how sustainable is it and who's winning and who's losing in the process. So there's so many questions to ask, but there's a number of specific ones from an economist point of view. One, I've been fascinated by the question of using fish from the wild as feed for aquaculture, because the balance, are we actually getting a net gain by raising these fish? So especially fish that are highly dependent on feed, like salmon or tuna or shrimp, or are we depleting wild fish supplies? In our earlier work in 2000, we found that a lot of wild fish were still used in the production of fish meal and fish oil, especially for some of these more higher valued species. And so our concern was that as the appetite for these higher valued species like salmon and shrimp and tuna grows, are we going to just put more and more pressure on the oceans? But the feed industry is just a fascinating industry in itself because it has responded to all these economic signals. And in the 90s, 80s, and 90s, actually, fish meal and fish oil was inexpensive for the aquaculture industry. It provided all the right nutrients for fish like salmon or trout or shrimp, and it was not an expensive alternative. So it was one of the least expensive alternatives. In the 2000s, when prices for a lot of commodities rose during this food crisis and commodity crisis that we saw, the price of fish meal really escalated, and the price of fish oil did too. And the industry found all sorts of ways to substitute away from fish meal into substitutes that would still provide the nutrition for fish, but that would come from, say, soy meal or canola oil or other plant-based products, or even rendered animal products, bone meal, feather meal, things from slaughterhouses. And so you start seeing the circular economy really develop of either direct use of crops or indirect use of crop and livestock waste in the production of feeds. And there was a concern for sustainability, but there was also just a straightforward economic management that was going on, and it was cheaper to do this. So the economics has really driven this huge transition. I mean, since our early paper, the amount of fish meal and fish oil that's been used in feeds has dropped by about 50%. So it's really, we've seen a very large decline because there's cheaper ways to get the same nutrients into fish.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's interesting to me when I think about these food systems to think when we eat salmon that may be more sustainable because it's not using fish meal and fish oil from wild caught fish, but is it using soy meal from the Amazon? That's a sustainability issue. Or is it using rendered animal fat from a chicken, slaughterhouse, in which case the consumer's really not getting a healthy salmon, they're kind of getting a hamburger now. So there are these trade-offs, nutrition trade-offs and environmental trade-offs that we always have as we improve and manage these systems for both economic reasons and for sustainability reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find this totally fascinating. And the other thing that's really changed is as aquaculture has expanded and the technology has improved generally, taking the waste from fish processing plants and making it into fish meal and fish oil has really expanded. And so we see a lot more of just these fish products going into fish meal and fish oil from wastes, actually. And so the more aquaculture we have and the more we can do this using fish processing waste, the more sustainable it will be. And I think for the listener, it's really important to know that this is occurring at a very wide scale, but it's not occurring, for example, waste from a salmon processing plant is not going into a salmon meal. So, that whole issue of the food safety issue has been avoided. So it would be, say, waste from a tuna processing plant may go into a salmon farm or into a tilapia farm. And that's all driven by economics. So that's interesting to me.
Right. Yeah. That was kind of the main thing I wanted to talk about, really, was that perception, which I think many people have had, that I think was very, very justified back in the 90s, that the inputs into aquaculture were greater than the outputs, and therefore it wasn't a sustainable enterprise. And in your paper, you quote some pretty astounding figures. I don't remember which taxa you were talking about, but in many cases, it was the input was about 5 times the output. And now we're down to incredible figures. If I remember correctly, again, shrimp is about 1 to 1. So that's kind of semi-sustainable. But that's on the high end of the range. Some of them are down to 0.3 or thereabouts. So that's incredible, the advances that have happened there. Can you maybe just say a bit about why that's happened, why there's been such an improvement in sustainability?
Yeah, the improvement has come from a much wider appreciation within the industry for sustainability. And I think that there was a lot of pressure on the industry to be more sustainable. And since they were almost an early growth stage, they had the options to kind of do it right, if you think about doing it, quote unquote, right, relative to earlier food production systems, earlier livestock systems, for example. But as I mentioned, the economics also drove this because fish meal made from wild fish was just becoming so expensive relative to the other alternatives, and especially crop-based products like soy meal or something like that. And so these other products just became less expensive and started to be targeted for this industry. So there's ways to think about the different components within the feeds. Obviously, they care about all the nutritional components and the micronutrient components, enzymes and so forth that are needed for each type of fish. That was all started to be much more directly targeted when the price of fish meal went up. In the early days, it was just easy to use wild fish because it wasn't expensive and it provided all of the basic nutrients, because that's what, for example, salmon ate from the beginning, as they ate the forage fish. So just throw the forage fish in there. But now it's really becoming a much more industrialized system in fine-tuning the feed ingredients.
So it sounds like that move towards sustainability was more market-driven than regulation-driven, right? Am I correct in understanding that? It was more the free market than government or UN pushes towards sustainability that made that happen?
Yeah, I mean, there are codes of conduct that are obviously put in place by United Nations agencies and so forth, but they're voluntary. I mean, there's no stick that is going to be enforced. And regulations really have never worked on the feed side of things. They've worked on other things like water quality or siting of aquaculture facilities. Those are things that governments typically regulate. But the feed and other inputs, and sometimes they regulate antibiotic use. So they might regulate some features, but the feed is not one that is regulated. And many people have argued the best way to regulate is actually to regulate the catch of these wild fish that would go into feeds. That's the side that should be regulated, and that will control the price that will influence the market-driven process. But really, this has been, if I were to summarize, a much more market-driven activity.
Right.
Change. And the industry in all fairness, I think many parts of this industry is trying to be sustainable, and especially the high valued side where the consumers are purchasing their fish and they're more environmentally aware. Then in particular for those species and species that go into Walmart, or retailers that actually have sustainability metrics themselves that they're enforcing down the value chain.
Mm-hmm.
You see much less of this when you're in a country like Bangladesh, where the consumer doesn't really care so much about sustainability, but they do care about the cost of their food on the plate.
Right. And then just kind of back to the, what kind of made that happen. I was curious to know not just the underlying mechanisms, but the actual techniques that are used to make aquaculture more sustainable. So you mentioned a shift from wild catch to plant-based and sort of land-based feed, but there are other ways as well, right? The efficiency was sort of vastly improved over the couple of decades since you wrote the first paper.
Yeah, the other technology is, of course, in breeding of these fish, and so just like any other animal product in the market, where you'll have breeding for higher growth and more efficient feed use and more efficient use of inputs. There's been a lot of breeding activity in certain species. So a lot of breeding activity in salmon and trout and shrimp, a lot of breeding activity in tilapia and increasingly in pangasus. So what we're seeing is, you asked me about the diversity of species early on, and I said 425 at maybe 450, when we get all the unidentified species that come into the system. But really, only 5% of that total, maybe 22 species, actually make up 75% of what the world is eating. So when you actually look at the dominance, we're shrinking species down to just, wouldn't say a handful, but a couple of handfuls, because there's a lot of investment that is put into breeding of these species, a lot of knowledge. And so when the producer, the aquaculturalist, is adopting a species, they want to know, okay, do I have a species that has high growth potential, a lot of disease resistance already built into it, that can tolerate fluctuations in temperature in the water, that is edible and has good taste to the consumer around the world. So they want all these attributes that are really attributes that come from breeding programs. And so naturally, as you see this, we're going to shrink the number of species that comprise the vast majority of what's eaten around the world.
And I guess that's exactly what's happened on land, right? We farm a very limited number of the species that occur in the world.
Yeah. And I've got a great example. I mean, when we wrote the first paper on the effect of aquaculture on world fish supplies, and we asked the question, is aquaculture adding to or depleting world fish supplies? And we went into the result that for some of these high valued species like salmon and shrimp, that the net balance was that we were using more fish than we were actually producing based on the statistics that we had at the time. One of the people within the aquaculture research industry, who is a fish nutritionist, was really very angry about the paper, because he said, you're not giving credit to all of the things that we're doing to make aquaculture more sustainable and higher growth and everything. And he came to Stanford later and I invited him to come and give a seminar, and he presented a lot of the genetics on salmon and trout. And he said, so this paper by Naylor et al. Came out in 2000, and it really angered all of us. And we were already trying to do the right things in terms of sustainability. But then the programs focused even more on how to breed fish to be more efficient users of crop-based material in feeds instead of this wild fish. And he said, now we can actually develop a salmon and a trout that are vegetarians, that don't require any fish meal or fish oil. So we've taken a carnivore and we've made it into a vegetarian. And he looked at me and he said, is that good enough for you? So I laughed, and it was great, but there are still issues. I mean, he would also say that your problems haven't gone away, because once you make it into a plant-based diet, the biggest threat to some of these species that are used to eating fish, like salmon, in their natural diets, is that they can't digest them as well. You might have more waste going out of these systems.
Mm-hmm.
And also the gut for the finfish is their immune system. And if the gut is not functioning well, their susceptibility to disease will go up. And there might be other physiological issues that come up. So people working in this area, as you said, it's complex, it's incredibly challenging. And I think people have done an incredible job at advancing, but it's wrong to say that we've solved all the problems either. And I get equally mad by people that say, oh, now aquaculture is, it's a silver bullet. We're just going to have plant-based material, recycled things. And they're not really thinking about those challenges for these breeders of trying to get it all right. The health of the fish, the growth of the fish, the resilience of the fish, the palatability of the fish. If you feed a fish soy, it's not going to taste like a salmon anymore. It's going to taste like something else. So all of these issues have to be put in place.
Does it really change the taste? Have you ever had the opportunity to compare salmon that's sort of wild fed versus soy fed? Does it really change the taste to that extent?
Well, for people, you should definitely go out and ask your friends in Japan who are used to eating wild fish. When you are here on the west coast of North America, in California, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, where salmon is a delicacy, and people love salmon. They will say the farm salmon just tastes so bland and I can't eat it. They're like, it doesn't taste like a fish. It tastes like something else. Well, it turns out there's a lot of people in the world, take our population in the United States and the Midwest, who actually prefer to have it not taste like a fish. They didn't really like fish in the beginning. And so have it be less fishy is not a bad thing for some consumers, but it's a terrible thing for people that have grown up and really love eating wild fish and wild salmon. Yeah.
Right. Back to the efficiency and sustainability issue. I was curious to know, I don't know if you know the answer to this, I don't think it's in the paper, but so the shift from wild feed, not the complete shift, but there's a proportional shift from wild feed to land-based feed, much of it plant-oriented, some of it's waste, but a lot of it is plant-based as well. And so that's creating its own issues because a lot of it is soy and palm oil and that kind of thing, which has land change consequences. But you also mentioned that it's a very small proportion of the global total of land that's used for feeding things that we eat. So maybe you could say something about that. But I was also, on top of that, I was curious to know, do you know if fish are more efficient at converting feed to food than other kinds of animals? So I know chickens are more efficient than pigs, for example, but are fish more efficient than others, or aquaculture?
Most of the fish are cold-blooded fish, and they are not actually using a lot of energy to just stay warm. So the amount of feed they're coming in goes directly out without expending this huge amount. So a salmon would be quite a bit more efficient than hogs, a swine, or poultry, or something like that. I mean, some people say that there's been modeling work that talks about climate change and feed efficiency in the future, and climate change and the impact on productivity of aquaculture. And so some of these models say as temperatures get warmer, in fact, fish may grow faster and so forth, and you'd have a higher output, but there may be a lot more disease problems that evolve with climate change. So there's pros and cons. Anyway, generally fish are more efficient than land-based animals at converting feed.
And then speaking of pros and cons, it was also very interesting to see the emphasis on your paper on extractive species. And what that means is species that extract their nutrients sort of directly from the water. You don't need to, they don't require any inputs. And specifically seaweed, which photosynthesize, and then the other is filter feeders, and many of the shellfish are filter feeders. Maybe you can just say a bit about why there's so much promise there, but then also perhaps a bit about the drawbacks or the trade-offs that are experienced with those groups of species.
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's a lot of attention in the sustainability field on those two sets of species as solving all of our problems. And they're slightly different. I mean, the filter feeding. So the bivalves, mainly, as I said, are a lot of shell weight, but they are assimilating the nutrients from the water column, and so that they can actually clean the water at the same time that they're providing food, which is another service that they're providing. But they can't do it all alone. I mean, you don't want to actually grow these filter feeders in a highly polluted area because you're going to have some food safety issues. They may filter the nutrients, but they're also going to be filtering toxins and other things that are in that water column. And so they have to actually be grown in a clean place for food safety reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't assimilate everything. You would need a huge area for them to assimilate all of those nutrients anyway. But they do provide this dual service. They're highly nutritious, and they're sustainable. And so particularly if we think about these bivalve systems that are grown in kind of local conditions that are fairly clean, they can add to livelihoods, they can provide food, they can keep the water column clean, both because they're filtering water, but because just by the nature of the production, people have to keep the water column clean. There can't be allowing pollution into that area. And so, at a localized level, it's great. But again, the conversion from live weight to edible weight is not very good. And so if you're really going to have people not eat terrestrial meat and not eat fin fish and all eat this, you're going to have huge amounts of this grown around the world, and I don't think it's going to scale at that level, to meet everyone's needs. And not everyone actually likes bivalves, or there's a lot of people allergic and so forth. So they do fit a need, but it's you got to keep in the whole context in mind. But as you said, the shells can be used for other products too. So the whole system can be useful, and it can be grown in a mixed environment, seaweeds and shellfish and finfish all together. And so there's lots of creative ways to do this. But I think it's a very good opportunity for localized systems in particular. Mm-hmm. The seaweed has gotten a lot of hype, and there are manifestos to say we're all going to just eat seaweed and it's going to solve all our problems. People have been saying that for decades. And so the people I worked with on the review paper that really knew the most about seaweed say, yes, it has promise, but it's always had promise. So it's always the commodity that's the promise of the future. But as I see it, the biggest problem is the market potential and the commercialization of these products, because to really make the most out of seaweeds, you want to extract everything that the seaweeds are producing. So you may want to take almost like a biorefinery approach, which we mentioned in the paper. You may want to extract the oil and put it into one product, extract the meal and put it into another product, and really make the most of it. Because right now, the value proposition for producers is not very good in most cases. You see these big systems in China that have been both supported by the government, but also have kind of a hold on the industry, a hold on the industrial process along that value chain that's coming out of this. But for the average farmer, around the world, the value proposition really isn't there. Alaskan fishermen, or for example, fishing families are right now trying to grow seaweed and in the off season, so they don't have to fish all the time, and they can make money out of seaweeds too and be more sustainable. But they are also looking for a consistent value opportunity where they know they can sell it into a market and always get a certain price that's worth their time, because this is a bulky commodity that's a lot of water, as I said, and it's not easy to manage and ship around. So these are issues that can have such potential to be solved, right? And I talked to an investor in the Silicon Valley who is in a startup company that is trying to get that value proposition. He said it's like a three-legged stool. We're trying to get the producers to grow the right species. We're trying to get the market to be able to have all these products. We're trying to get the investors to believe in both of these groups. And, and it hasn't quite come together yet because it's a little more complicated. And so standing alone, you think, okay, it works. I can think of ways that it works, but you have to think, okay, that investor has this opportunity, but they can also invest in something else that has more promise, that is just going to work easier for them. So it really has to be an investor and a value proposition that believes in it, that can actually put all this together and get this market to work. So I think it's feasible, but there are a lot of other lower hanging fruit, if that's what you want to call it, that people seem to go for before they do that. The other thing related to this extractive species that's in our paper is the idea of this integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, IMTA, which would use all of these species together, algae and shellfish and finfish all together, and be able to harness all of the ecological dynamics that make all of these commodities grow well and work well together. And there have been a lot of experimentation, and some of these species, actually in South Africa, there's been some good results from some commercialization of IMTA, but generally it hasn't taken off. And it's also been studied for a couple of decades and hasn't quite taken off commercially like these other activities. Because when it gets down to it, it's easier for a producer to grow one thing and manage it well, because already just growing one of those things has enough challenges, disease and climate and storms and market and all of these things. So then to manage three at once, and it's just more complicated. So I'm always thinking about what's best for that producer that's actually having to do this, and how can we make it work for those people? I really love field work. My career has been based up until COVID on going out into the field and talking to people, especially farmers and producers. And I love it because, the challenge is so much larger than sitting at a university and doing our research and teaching class. Like, really, they're accountable to try to make this all work every single day. And it's very, very challenging. So I have compassion for the producers that may not want the most complex system when it's already quite complex, even with what we might think of as a simple system.
Maybe just to end off, we're dipping into this territory already, and you've already said quite a bit about it. But I'm just kind of wondering about solutions for the future. This idea, this polycultural system idea that you mentioned, as far as I understand, is quite big and has been for centuries, quite big in Asia, especially in China. But you're talking about doing that at scale, right? Which is a different proposition altogether. So you've outlined the challenges in doing that, but what are sort of some of the promises of aquaculture? And it's already looking at the 20-year period that you've examined, there have been incredible advances. But what do you think are the most promising possibilities to make the next 20 years even more groundbreaking and more positive?
Well, you're right. The polyculture, particularly in pond-based systems, you've seen a lot of these inland, the freshwater systems, again, having many species in there, and farmers are just pulling out different species, and sometimes they're selling the prawns and eating the lower valued species themselves. And so at that scale, that actually is really working very well for a lot of people. If you want to increase the productivity, you're going to start focusing on one of the species, what's going to enable that growth to go higher. So in terms of the future, I think the big promises are, one, I think we've seen this huge improvement on the feed and nutrition side, and I think that field is really expanding and improving. There are technologies that are out there that involve insect meal, or taking some of the algae meal from the seaweeds and making it into a very high protein source of feeds for other aquaculture species. There are ways in which the circular economy and the innovation in the feed side, I think, is going to just continue to improve, and it's going to provide markets for everybody and bring the sustainability even higher up across the board. So that one to me seems like a really fun and interesting field to be in. There are, infrastructure facilities now, land-based systems that are either these raceways or fully on-land systems that haven't quite come to fruition because they do tend to crash. The full life cycle on land systems tend to crash, these recirculating aquaculture systems, RAS. But for certain aspects of the life cycle, they can be extremely good, for example, at the juvenile stage and so forth. So there you're taking the activities out of the ocean, you're taking a very high value crop, making it even more productive because you're protecting that species on land in these systems and giving it a jumpstart. So those systems are really coming along. And then a big question will be these offshore systems and how sustainable they are. Again, this is a more infrastructure idea, but can we just locate some of these systems way offshore, either next to wind farms, which are starting to become much more abundant around the world as we wean off fossil fuels? Can you attach some of these infrastructure in the same areas so you're not compounding the problem of marine spatial planning? So a lot of work is going on with those systems. If they're in a highly circulating system and you're not having the fish spend too much energy in that highly circulating system, obviously you can make some progress. But so those are sort of technologies of the future. I think that the biggest advance that I've seen is just in the incredible leaps and bounds by which the industry itself takes sustainability as one of its leading objectives in the design of everything they do along the entire supply chain. And so that to me is really encouraging, because it's actually the starting point is let's figure out the economics and the productivity to make this sustainable from the start. And so the conversation seems to me, the discourse around this has really improved a lot in terms of trying to make this one of the more sustainable food systems. I guess that's a promising thing. But realistically, it's not everywhere. I mean, really, people are people, and when people are trying to make money, they're going to cut corners. You're going to see antibiotic use. You're going to have disease issues. You're still going to have these problems, and so there are always going to be things that you're going to watch out for, because the average person is trying to make more, not less money on these things. And so I'm hoping, as an economist, that economists actually will start playing a larger role in this industry, because to date, economists have played less of a role than, say, ecologists or aquaculturalists, and hopefully they can put their minds to good work here too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just in general, just as a conservation biologist, I hope to see economists active in more areas of my field, just all over the place. There are some, but they're a very rare species. So it would definitely be good to see more of you all over the place.
I know. And it's one of the things that we're trying to do at Stanford right now is we're actually launching a new school of sustainability and climate at Stanford. And it's a big deal because, to have a whole new school happens once every, say, 70 years or something.
Wow.
It's causing a complete reorganization of everything. But to date, a lot of the economists on campus have not been very interdisciplinary. They're sitting over in the economics department doing their economic studies, but they're not really listening to the scientists and engaging with the scientists and really thinking about solutions for the future. And so we have, among other things, a hiring process where we're really trying to draw in many more social scientists to work with the scientists to solve some of these problems. Because at the end of the day, we have human behavior at the root of all of this. And if we don't understand human behavior and what's driving our activities and what can change our activities, even technology can't do everything.
Okay, for next time, this is still to be confirmed, but I hope to cover another topic that's strongly influenced by technological advances and market forces, and which I've been wanting to find out more about for quite a while now. That is the effects of different forms of energy generation on biodiversity. I'm going to ask about the relative impacts of different technologies, both renewable and non-renewable, and how this information is being considered or not considered in the global discussion on cleaning up our energy production as global demand for energy continues to increase. I hope you'll listen in with us.